Alright, ladies, good morning. Sorry I'm not there with you today, but hopefully you're having a good day. I didn't want to get too far behind with our material, so what I have here is a video that runs through about the first half of the Chapter 8 notes on photosynthesis. Believe it or not, this half of the PowerPoint just kind of sets the stage and background for photosynthesis. And then next time what we will do is go into the actual process and sort of learn it step by step, kind of like we've learned respiration. Now, as you see here, we got several essential questions this time around, basically looking at how organisms are capable of storing free energy and capturing free energy. And then we'll look at those pathways that the plant will use to convert that into chemical energy. And we'll also compare respiration and photosynthesis. So here's Charlotte dressed up like a plant in honor of today's notes. And for those of you who are anywhere close to as dorky as me, I actually bring Star Wars into this PowerPoint. Okay, so we have covered cellular respiration, and although I'm sure it's still a little foggy, that really has allowed us to see how carbohydrates get used for the energy that is in them. But the question becomes, how does the energy get into a carbohydrate? We know from freshman year and food chains and food webs that all of the energy in the universe comes from the sun. So how does it go from the sun to this chemical form that we can eat? You might remember from ecology kind of things that heterotrophs are us, right? We consume things for energy, consume foods, and then the autotrophs, or the producers, are able to harness the energy from the sun and kind of generate their own food. And so this would include the plants and algae and cyanobacteria, which means blue-green bacteria. And these organisms can all produce their own sort of food energy. Now, the way they do this is photosynthesis, right? This is a metabolic process. It's a major anabolic, right, building up process that converts solar energy into the chemical energy we find in carbohydrates. Now, at the cellular level, photosynthesis takes place in the organelle called a chloroplast that we saw in Unit 2. Chloroplasts are going to be found in all of the green parts of plants, but they by far are going to have their highest concentration in the leaves of plants. And so just a rough kind of estimate is that you have about 500,000 chloroplasts in a leaf if you look at just 1 square millimeter of its surface. So the number in an entire leaf is almost uncountable. Chloroplasts are going to be found in the mesophyll cells of a leaf. So this isn't like the outside of the leaf, like the skin of the leaf, but rather this is the internal tissue of the leaf. Each mesophyll cell itself probably has about 30 to 40 chloroplasts in it. So if you look at this little cross-section over here of a leaf, you'll see that, so here's like the bottom side of the leaf, here's the top side of the leaf, and then you have this tissue in here full of these mesophyll cells. And there's something called dense mesophyll here at the top and spongy mesophyll. You'll notice this is more free space down here. But that doesn't really matter. But you see all these cells with chloroplasts. Now, in order to sort of bring materials to and from these cells, liquids can move through a plant, kind of like they move through your circulatory system, and we use this very similar term, which is a vein. So plants have veins that come and go from the inside of the leaves that bring water, and they bring other dissolved solids and nutrients. And then you have stomata, which are these pores that we'll study more later this year as well, which allow gases in and out of the leaf. So here's a slide I'm going to kind of skip because I'm going to tell you all these things with a picture on the next slide. But some vocab terms we're going to have are stroma, thylakoids, grana, and then chlorophyll should sound pretty familiar to you. So if we look at these pictures, here's an electron micrograph of a real chloroplast, and then a little cartoon from the book that Dr. Wong and I have written. Basically, a chloroplast has a double membrane, just like mitochondria. And then the inside of the double membrane is called the stroma. So that internal space is called the stroma. Inside that stroma, you have these stacks of little sacs. So what you really have is like a third level of membrane here. And each of these little sacs is called a thylakoid. When you stack up a thylakoid, or you stack up several thylakoids, we call it a granum. So when you look inside of a chloroplast, you see all these grana all over the place, would be the plural, right? And it is within these grana that we find chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is that chemical we'll talk about here in a second that you find inside a thylakoid that can perform or help you perform photosynthesis. So essentially, a leaf in a plant is an antenna for sunlight. It absorbs sunlight. That's why leaves, for the most part, are kind of wide and flat, so that more sun hits their surface, right? And inside that leaf, you have chlorophyll, which is a pigment. And it's one of actually several pigments that you find inside of a chloroplast. Now, in nature and society, whatever, a pigment is a substance that absorbs visible light. You've got pigments in your clothing right now. We have pigments in our skin. Plants have pigments. Essentially, anything that has a color has pigments in it. Now, here's how this works. You guys might recall, maybe from a previous science class, that energy moves in waves. Right? So it moves like this. That's a terrible wave. Let's try again. It moves like this. Now, the distance from peak to peak, or from valley to valley, is called a wavelength. And the way energy is kind of defined or described is by the length of its wavelength. So if you have really, really tiny wavelengths, then you have things like gamma rays, X-rays, and UV radiation or UV light. If you have sort of a longer wavelength, like look at this, 10 to the third meters, really, really long wavelengths, then you have things like radio waves and microwaves. And then right in the middle of that, if you look between 380 nanometers of length and 750 nanometers of length, you have a visible light spectrum. Energy that moves at these wavelengths gives you visible light. Now here's how this works, though, with your eyes. Different pigments absorb different wavelengths, and those that get absorbed will actually disappear. So if a pigment absorbs a certain wavelength, those colors go away. Wavelengths that don't get absorbed get reflected. They bounce off of whatever it is, they go into your eyes, and that's the color you see. Now, if a pigment absorbs all the wavelengths, then you see black. If a pigment absorbs none of the wavelengths, you see white. But if a pigment absorbs some of them, you get a particular color. Let's look at how this works on the next slide. Okay, so this graph on the upper right shows you three different pigments that you can find in plants, and it shows you what wavelengths of light they absorb best. So in most plants you have one type of chlorophyll called chlorophyll A, you have another type of chlorophyll called chlorophyll B, and then you have a group of what we refer to as accessory pigments that are the carotenes, or the carotenoids, that are in there as well. Now all three of these things can absorb light, but they absorb different wavelengths of light. So notice here, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B both absorb similar areas. They absorb light in the 400 to 500 nanometer range, and they absorb light down here. So here's the first part. They absorb light down here in the red-orange range. So if those things get absorbed by the pigments and they go away, look what gets reflected. Into your eyes come shades of green and yellow, and that gives most plants their characteristic green or yellow color. Now, I think this is really cool. I know I'm dorky, but this is interesting. So the carotenes are different, right? The accessory pigments, you'll notice here on this graph, they absorb different wavelengths of light. If we look at their graph right here, they absorb light in this 400, 500 range, the blues and the purples, but they also absorb kind of further up into the greens. And then that's it, right? These are the lights that they absorb. So that leaves these colors that you would be seeing if carotenes were the major pigments in plants. Well, in the fall, when temperatures start to change, the chlorophyll pigments are kind of gotten rid of, or they break down sooner than the carotenoid pigments. So levels of chlorophyll decrease in the leaves, leaving primarily the carotenoids, or the carotenes, to absorb or reflect light. So they absorb all this light and they reflect this. And so your plants in the fall shift from mainly green or greenish yellow in color to pretty shades of yellow and orange and red. So that's why plants change their color in the fall, is because of these different pigments. But again, whatever gets absorbed, you don't see. What gets reflected back at you is what you see with your eyes. Now, just as a side note, the way that you can measure this absorptive ability is a device called a spectrophotometer, which I think Miss Reith uses in a chemistry class every once in a while. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting is that scientists don't understand photosynthesis that well, the process at least. So we have a much better understanding of the reactions that take place in cellular respiration than we do in photosynthesis. This is nice for you because it means you have to learn less details in terms of reactions as we move forward. However, they have kind of ironed out the overall chemical reaction, which you can see right here. In the photosynthetic reaction, you're going to take 3 carbon dioxides, combine them with 3 water molecules, plus energy from the sun, and it's going to give you a carbohydrate molecule and some oxygen as a byproduct. Now, a lot of times, the way we write this is to double everything, though. So we say 6 carbon dioxides gives you, 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 water molecules plus sunlight gives you a very familiar carbohydrate, glucose, and 6 oxygens. So, if you haven't caught it yet, this is cellular respiration in reverse, right? It's backwards. In respiration, we took sugar and oxygen that you inhale, and we produce carbon dioxide that you exhale, water, and then ATP energy. In this case, we use an input of energy from the sun to perform another oxidation reduction reaction that goes in the opposite direction and is anabolic rather than catabolic. So in this case, we're going to take carbon dioxide gas, we're going to take water, and we're going to build a sugar from it. Now, I like this too. It's a little breakdown of where these different kind of atoms go. Water is actually split up by photosynthesis. It does this generating oxygen gas, and then surprisingly enough, using the hydrogens to regenerate water, or also to go into that carbohydrate. Carbon dioxide gas is your source of carbon, right? It gives us the carbon that we use in our carbohydrate, and it also gives us oxygen to be used in the carbohydrate and in that regeneration of water. Notice that this is why plants need to be watered, right? Because they need to get water into their system. And the equation on the last slide showed us why plants require sun, right, to power this reaction. But you may or may not have known that fertilizers never have carbon in them. Carbon is never something that plants lack or really need because there's an endless supply of carbon in the atmosphere around them. So, obviously as humans, we get our carbon by eating things like carbohydrates. But for plants and other photosynthetic organisms, they get their carbon from the air, which is a super efficient way to do this. And that leaves them with fertilizer or nutrient needs that involve other elements that are not carbon. Okay, so photosynthesis has basically two stages. So respiration had, 3 stages on the aerobic side, or 2 stages on the anaerobic. Photosynthesis has 2 stages. It has the light reactions, and it has what are sometimes called the dark reactions, but better called the Calvin cycle. Now, this is why I like to bring Star Wars into this, because of course you have the light side, which is the good guys like Yoda, and you got the dark side like Darth Vader. The first part's the light reactions. We call them light reactions because they require light. Right? This is where we use that sunlight that comes in, and we convert that solar energy into chemical energy in the form of ATP and NADPH, which, notice the P there, it's a little bit different molecule than the NADH we've learned previously. The light reactions are the photo part of this. They're the part that require the sunlight. Then the second part, the Calvin cycle, is where we use energy that comes from the light reactions to reduce CO2 into carbohydrates. So in other words, the light reactions use the sun and harness its energy in one way. Then that energy goes to the Calvin cycle, the second part, to actually lead to carbohydrates. The reason that the dark reactions is the name that the scientists have really tried to get away from is that these don't have anything to do with the dark at all. They used to call them the dark reactions because the second part didn't require light directly. But I think I agree that it almost sounds like you need dark for these to happen, and that's not true. The second part of this can happen 24 hours a day, no matter what. But the light reactions actually require a source of light. So here's an overview of photosynthesis in our chloroplast. Notice that you're going to have light and water come in during the light reactions. That's going to produce oxygen as a byproduct, and it's going to produce 2 intermediary sources of energy, ATP in the cell and this NADPH, which, as you might guess, is another electron carrier like we saw before. Then the Calvin cycle involves the input of carbon dioxide along with these energy intermediates and produces our carbohydrate, sugar. So if we look at what the light reactions kind of start with, finish with, and that sort of thing, the light reactions will directly involve these 4 things. They will directly involve bringing in solar energy from the sun. They will directly involve turning NADP plus into NADPH, which is an electron carrier. It's just like NADH before, right? So it's a little truck that we can load electrons into. The light reactions will also directly involve the formation or the generation of ATP via, check it out, chemiosmosis, so same kind of process as we saw in respiration, and then photophosphorylation. So as you might guess, this is a phosphorylation that makes ATP using sunlight. And then the fourth thing that will happen during the light reactions is that we will release oxygen gas. Is really a waste product. Plants don't need this at all. It's just a byproduct that they get rid of, and then obviously it keeps us alive. Now, notice that the light reactions do not directly involve carbon dioxide, which is one of our major reactants in this whole thing, nor does it involve, or do they involve, the production of carbohydrates. So one of your major reactants and your major product don't come from the light reactions. They come in later on down the line. So photosynthesis starts with the light reactions. This starts when pigments absorb photons of light and convert that into chemical energy. Scientists often describe light as a particle, a discrete particle, as we said earlier, that moves in waves. We call these particles photons. It's not really like we can trap a photon or we can measure a photon or weigh a photon. So it's not a tangible thing, but it is thought of as a particle. Now, chlorophylls and the other pigments as well will absorb these photons of light, and that is just a kind of little pouch of energy that they take on. Now, chlorophylls do most of the photosynthesis, so most of the absorption of photons that goes toward photosynthesis is in the chlorophylls. The carotenoids, those other accessory pigments, are more often seen used for photoprotection. They absorb sort of extra light energy so that that energy doesn't potentially damage the DNA of the cell or some other parts of the cell that we need. You also have carotenoids. Your retina in your eye has carotenoids for photoprotection. So if you absorb too much sunlight into your eyes, you know that can hurt, right? If you look right at a bright light or look toward the sun. And these carotenoids are there to help protect you from that. Now, the other thing that you might have heard this term carotene before. A lot of vegetables are said to be high in carotenes. A lot of times the common one is beta carotene. See this in carrots and tomatoes a lot. And these are healthy for you because in your cells you can get a generation of what are referred to as oxygen-free radicals. This is when oxygen, kind of different versions of oxygen, are created, maybe due to excessive light in the case of a plant, or for us, a lot of times they're created when you are using your peroxisomes a lot to detoxify things. And these oxygen-free radicals can damage your DNA, which obviously is bad. Now, the nice thing about these carotenes is that they can get rid of oxygen-free radicals. So if you've heard of antioxidants that you get in a lot of fruits and vegetables, a lot of berries are high in antioxidants, again tomatoes. Antioxidants are carotenes, pigments, that will remove these oxygen-free radicals from your body and supposedly will help to reduce risk of cancer and other things that might occur if we damage your DNA. So it's kind of a cool side note there. What you see here on this graph, on this slide, before we move on to the next one, is that different wavelengths of light will drive photosynthesis better. And we call this an action spectrum. This is a graph of how well photosynthesis will work at certain wavelengths. And notice that photosynthesis works best here and here. And this is where chlorophyll absorbs. Right, so earlier we showed you where chlorophyll does most of its light absorbing. It's the primary photosynthetic pigment. So the light that chlorophyll absorbs best is the light that's going to drive photosynthesis the best. Now, how does this work? Okay, so when light gets absorbed, we say that chlorophyll gets excited, just like I know you are right now to be learning all this stuff. What that means is that photons will cause a chlorophyll molecule's electrons to be boosted in energy. Now, Miss Reith could speak to this so much better than me at this chemical level, but essentially electrons that absorb extra energy from the sun are going to go from the ground state to a different orbital, which is a higher energy orbital. Now, when an electron does this, it moves to this excited state that you see here. So light comes in, chlorophyll electron gets all fired up and excited. Generally what happens when an electron gets excited or moves to this high energy state is that electron is really unstable. So it's going to want to quickly move back to the ground state if it can. To do this, it needs to get rid of that extra energy that it had absorbed. So in most situations, what we see is that an electron that gets excited by extra energy releases that energy again, either as heat or in some cases as light, so that it can go back to its ground state. So that's what it's showing you here, is that the electron is going to drop back to the ground state by getting rid of the energy in heat or light versions. Now this is how you get fluorescence. So like things that glow in the dark, right? We've all had a glow in the dark toy when we were a little kid or something like that. And the way those work, as you might remember, is you hold that glow in the dark thing up to a bright light in your house. And then you go into a dark room and it'll glow in the dark, right? Maybe a Halloween toy you had at some point or something like that. The way that works is that there's a chemical pigment in that glow-in-the-dark stuff that absorbs the light, then it releases the light back off as its electrons go back to the ground state. And it's that release of the light that gives you that greenish glow from a glow-in-the-dark thing. A similar thing happens with a glow stick that are common this time of year for Halloween. When you crack those glow sticks, what you're doing is causing a chemical reaction inside of there, at least in some of the different brands of glow sticks. A chemical reaction that leads to excited electrons, and as those electrons move back to their ground state, the light is given off and you see a glow. Now, that's cool, but that's not what plants do, right? Plants don't glow. They do something different. Now, in a chloroplast, you've got pigments arranged with some protein as well into what we refer to as a photosystem. Now, a photosystem at a molecular level is what scientists designed solar panels off of. So if you've ever seen solar panels on a building or something like that, the idea came from the plant photosystems. Now, a photosystem has a reaction center, which is actually just two special chlorophyll A molecules, and then an array or complex of other pigments that surround that reaction center. All of these pigments, sometimes referred to as an antenna array, can absorb photons of light from the sun, and then they transfer that energy from one molecule to the next until they funnel all of that energy into the reaction center. So here's what this looks like. You've got sunlight that can be really absorbed by any of these chlorophyll molecules. Then it bounces around from one to the next until all that energy gets passed to the reaction center. Now, when we look at a thylakoid in any kind of plant, we see two different types of reaction centers. Two different types of photosystems. We have photosystem 2, sometimes called PS2, and photosystem 1, called PS1. Now, we're going to talk about this more next class, and this will drive you crazy. But photosystem 1 was discovered first, so we called it photosystem 1, but it's actually not first in the sequence of photosynthesis. So photosystem 2 actually comes first, that makes sense, and photosystem 1 comes second. But we'll get into that next time. Now, each type of photosystem is defined by its reaction center. And the reaction center is basically an electron acceptor, kind of like oxygen was for respiration. And the reaction centers can differ. In photosystem 2, we have a reaction center that we call P680. And we call it this because this reaction center, and therefore this type of photosystem, is best at absorbing light with a wavelength of 680 nanometers. So in other words, it is the photosynthesis 680 reaction center. Photosystem 1 is called P700 for the same reason. This one is going to do photosynthesis best at about 700 nanometers. Now, both of these photosystems are involved in a complex kind of chain of reactions that can take light energy and power the synthesis of ATP and NADPH, an electron carrier. And the way that these photosystems do this is they pass electrons along the thylakoid membrane. We haven't studied anything like in the last couple weeks where it was a bunch of proteins that pass electrons down a chain, have we? So as you'll see, this is going to be a really, really similar process. I'm not going to say that photosynthesis is easy, but once you know cellular respiration, photosynthesis is really not a big deal. It's really easy to get a hold of once you understand respiration. So intentionally, we started with the tougher part, respiration, and so hopefully that's going to make photosynthesis come a little easier. Okay, I've talked way too much already. I hope this at least kind of helps explain parts that you maybe have seen in the book in Chapter 8, and next time we'll really dive into the actual process of photosynthesis. Thanks for listening. I'll see you guys soon.